For Julie in England, I need to apologize in advance for my voice. I'm suffering from a cold. In the end, China went its own way, as if the Americans had never come. This quote from Barbara Tuchman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Stillwell and the American Experience in China, underscores certain messianic tendencies in the way America chooses to interact with the world and the ultimate and inevitable outcome during the period 1919 to 1949. The U.S. approach to China during this period was by no means the last time the U.S. would attempt to impose its vision on an unwilling foreign country, and by no means the last time a foreign country would seek to use the U.S. as a means of enhancing the economic well-being of corrupt officials. This is a pattern of behavior that we would see happen again and again, and not just in Asia. However, the desired outcome that Americans hoped to achieve in China would be unprecedented, and this was the second coming of Jesus. Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. You found us. Thank you. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. So in our last episode, the centuries-old imperial system in China fell, either in 1911 or 1912, depending on one's preference for dates.
And the reason to mention both years is that the Xinhai Revolution of October 1911 led to the abdication of the last emperor in February 1912. So depending on which one you want to count as the end of the empire, you can pick either 1911 or 1912.
This seemed to indicate at the time that China would become a functioning republic. One was certainly proclaimed. However, really what would persist in China would be the absence of a fully functioning central government. In the wake of the fall of the imperial system, new elites, many the products of American missionary outreach efforts, rose to try and replace the emperors with a vision for the future that would find favor in the West, but not necessarily with the Chinese.
The fall of the imperial system was not nearly as neat as initially assumed. Yes, China had a republic, but it was internally destabilized, and it would continue to be internally destabilized through wars and revolutions up until 1949, when the Chinese communists took over. It was only then that it could be said that power was consolidated under a single entity within the country as a whole. The rise of China's new elites in the 1920s involved four big families, three of which were related to each other through marriage. These were the Chang, the Song, the Kung, and the Chen. And this provided a certain hope for the continuing influx of American missionaries. These were the so-called nationalist elite, and we could say that they were thoroughly westernized. The first three were related to each other by marriage and were strongly influenced by missionary culture, and some were educated at Methodist liberal arts colleges in the U.S. The missionaries assumed that with the rise of these families in the upper reaches of the nascent republic, that this would provide them with unprecedented support and ultimately the Christianization of China. Both Chiang Kai-shek and his wife were Christians. His wife, Mei Ling, was the daughter of Charlie Sung, who we met in the previous episode. Mei Ling was related by birth or by marriage to other prominent Chinese Christians that made up the Song and Kong families, and who would ultimately lead China through 1949. Before there were all manner of notions about Israel and its establishment leading to the second coming of Christ, American fundamentalists entertained similar notions about China, then is now selectively using certain portions of the Bible to make their case. Converting China to Christianity was the great undertaking for U.S. Protestant churches throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Accompanying the talk about the second coming of Christ were the beliefs that Chiang Kai-shek and his wife were actively seeking to promote Christianity throughout China. These would form the basis for a significant segment of the Chiang regime's support within the United States. While Americans, with their exclusionary immigration policies, were intent on prohibiting Chinese from sharing the country with them, they had no such compunction about sharing a religion, whether the Chinese wanted that religion or not. The missionaries, who by 1919 had been a presence in China beyond just the confines of Canton, had emerged as a special target of the 1900 Boxer Rebellion. And it's worth going back to kind of consider the 1900 Boxer Rebellion. By doing so, we can look at how this is impacting missionary culture in China in the era of the Republic.
We summarized the Boxer Rebellion in the last episode, but let's get into the details of it now to explain the traumatic effect it had on the missionaries.
Okay, so Marshall brings up the Boxer Rebellion, so we'll rewind about 20 years back in time and consider what happened there. China had 18 provinces and Manchuria had 3. All 3 Manchurian provinces and 13 of the 18 Chinese provinces had come under a recognized foreign sphere of influence by 1900. France, the German Empire, the Kingdom of Italy, the Japanese Empire, the Russian Empire, and the United Kingdom, the British Empire, all had spheres of influence in China by about 1900. And even Belgium had a railway concession there. In September 1898, the Empress Dowager of China deposed her nephew, Quang Shu. He had been engaged in the 100 Days, which was a rather weak and short campaign to westernize and reform Chinese government and society. She overthrew him. Her government was deeply traditional, superstitious. It's been characterized as ignorant, corrupt, haughty, proud, disdainful, and her governing style was viewed as capricious. If she had a whim, she would act on that whim. Things started to change in 1899. Italy did not have a sphere of influence in China, and it attempted to gain one in something called the Sunmen Bay incident, which turned out to be a fiasco for Italy. Italy, without getting into a lot of details, tried to get a concession for itself in Zhejiang province, and the Chinese actually rebuffed them. And for once, the Chinese actually got their way, and Italy did not get a sphere of influence. This actual success against the European power emboldened the Empress Dowager's imperial government, and they thought that they could maybe get away with doing more to push out the foreigners than had been the case in recent times. Now, all this happened as the Boxer movement arose near Peking, which is now called Beijing. The Boxers were about 90% peasants. They were colorfully dressed. They wore red. They had no clear leader. They had no coherent philosophy. What they wanted to do was defend their ancient civilization from the degradation of foreigners by the simple method of killing all foreigners and all Chinese converts to Christianity, who they viewed as a foreign influence. And their battle cry, in fact, was Sha, Sha, which means kill, kill. And they went into combat that way. What were they so upset about? Well, they were offended to various degrees by foreigners and foreign influence in China. And what were the issues there? Well, certainly the missionaries were a large part of it. The missionaries were arrogant. They showed little interest in Chinese culture or the Chinese language. They tended to view Chinese customs as pagan and unworthy, something to be gotten past, not respected in any way. Western businessmen operating in China were similarly insensitive and dismissive, and they tended to hire bullies as overseers and foremen, so that didn't ingratiate them with the Chinese population much either. Another thing was the construction of churches, Western housing, railways, and telegraph lines, as well as Western mining operations that began in China, completely foreign ideas in China. And in Chinese thinking, these desecrated the land and therefore the spirituality of Chinese civilization as reflected through the concept of feng shui. Now, in more recent times, we've kind of made feng shui silly in the West by worrying about, where you put your couch in your living room or something like that. That's how people think of feng shui. But in China, it actually has a long history of spiritual history of the proper order of things, where things should and should not be. Well, railways, housing, telegraph lines, etc., all ruined the feng shui. They damaged it. Railways often ran through things like burial grounds, which are very common in China. Bridges disrupted river traffic so that the high-masted junks couldn't get through, and that disrupted trade. The Chinese peasants even felt that the moaning sound of wind through telegraph lines was the sound of tortured ancestral spirits who had been injured by all of this disruption of the feng shui. So the Chinese even believed, at least the peasants did, that the disturbance of feng shui led to things like natural disasters. So things like earthquakes and floods had been brought on by the presence of foreigners. Also, missionaries were protégés of Chinese officials. The Chinese peasants viewed the Chinese officials as corrupt and oppressive, and so by extension, they viewed the missionaries in the same way.
And interestingly, the officials that the missionaries are going to kind of foster in the Republic, they are going to be corrupt in their own way. That is kind of going to, they will enjoy very little support amongst Chinese peasants. Forward-looking people, a minor middle class, yes, but they're not going to be. They're going to be violating so many taboos with some of the things that they're going to be proposing. All of these being things that we admire them for doing. It's still going to cloud the issue and appear to be corruption on top of corruption.
And remember that the Boxers were primarily peasantry, and these were not educated people even remotely or worldly in any sense of the word. They were Chinese peasants who knew nothing. A lot of them had never seen a foreigner, but they were told a lot of things about foreigners and had ideas about what the foreigners were up to.
It's also a way of kind of, since the Empress is supporting this, the imperial government has not been doing well for itself throughout the 19th century, and this is a way, not unlike what we see today in other parts of the world where they'll like target foreigners, even in our own country. When things aren't going well for a regime, well, let's just pick on a few foreigners and basically say they're the problem, they're to blame.
And there's going to be a lot of that.
The missionaries are the Somalis of China in the 19th century.
Yeah. It was very easy to propagandize the people who became Boxers since they knew so little about the world or they knew so little about foreigners. So another example would be things like Christian values and practices were propagandized as having dark effects on Chinese people. When Catholic priests administered last rites to a dying Chinese person, this was propagandized as them actually engaging in some kind of incantation to kill the Chinese person. The Chinese also couldn't understand why the Westerners, the missionaries in particular, were so concerned about saving all these economically useless babies and children. The proliferation of unnecessary babies and children, all that did was, create another mouth to feed without giving you any benefit. Remember that in China, the practice of infanticide, particularly female infanticide, was quite common and well established in the culture. They really couldn't understand why anybody would want to keep such economically useless babies, but what they did decide was that they must be keeping them to butcher them in order to engage in some kind of process of alchemy that would create silver. So this is the kind of thinking you're dealing with among the Boxers.
That's pretty out there.
That's pretty out there, isn't it? Another issue was that Chinese converts to Christianity tended to benefit from the intercession of missionaries in Chinese affairs. So if they got in some kind of trouble, the missionaries would intervene on their behalf, and they would get away with things that they might not have gotten away with had they not converted. So the Chinese converts even became, in a way, a privileged class within China, and a resented one in the eyes of the Chinese peasantry.
And this kind of runs counter to what we see, when we're looking at some of the Westerners who were brought before Chinese justice. Chinese justice was more about punishment than it was about justice. And this was how they understand the way of the world. If you're brought before, you're probably guilty. There is the whole judicial process that we take for granted, at least in most parts of these United States, was just simply not part of the culture.
Suffice it to say that Westerners didn't have much respect for the Chinese judicial system of the 19th century, did they?
Well, that's why they wanted extraterritoriality.
Demanded extraterritoriality.
Yeah.
And then finally, one last thing to point out is that then there was opium. Isn't there always opium? And even though China was actually growing opium domestically by the late 19th century, there was a significant amount of opium grown domestically, there was still a lot of foreign trade in opium. And in the eye of the Boxers, opium, which was understood to have a lot of deleterious effects on society, was viewed as an entirely foreign influence at that time. So they blamed it entirely on foreigners and ignored the fact that China was also growing some of its own. So based on this, between 1890 and 1899, There were anti-missionary actions in all 18 of the China provinces, the provinces of China proper. So violence against missionaries was becoming more and more common in the 1890s.
And violence against Christians.
And violence against Chinese Christians as well, yes, Chinese converts. So the Boxers themselves, against this background, where did they come from? Their actual name for themselves in Chinese translates as the Fists of Righteous Harmony. They became known as the Boxers because missionaries who observed them engaging in physical exercises that they performed in order to, they thought would help make them impervious to Western bullets and artillery and things. Of course, it did not, but that's what they thought. Watching them do it, thought it looked like a Western shadow boxer. And so they started calling them the Boxers, and the name stuck, and that's where the name comes from in the Western world. They kind of came out of a shadowy pedigree. There are various ideas of where the foundation of the Boxers was in terms of previous movements and philosophical thoughts and things like that, but there isn't really any clear evidence that any of that is true. They were first documented in Shandong province, which is the peninsula that sticks out towards Korea. It separates the Yellow Sea from the East China Sea. They were first documented there in May of 1898, and they quickly gained the support of at least some provincial governors and at least the tacit support of the imperial government, as Marshall has already mentioned. The Empress Dowager knew her army was pretty useless against Westerners at this point. They'd lost the 2 Opium Wars, for example. They'd also lost the war against the Japanese in 1894, 1895. So her army was pretty useless, and she spent the money allocated to rebuild her navy after the losses in the war against Japan on the Summer Palace. So she didn't have any navy either.
I think she'd built like a kind of boat that was made out of marble with some of that money.
Yes, not terribly practical for military use.
A marble navy, no.
Yeah. So what did the Empress Dowager do? Well, she was anti-foreign. In fact, she hated the foreigners. She and her court did. So she turned to the Boxers to defend China against Western incursions. Now, it was thought that they could summon ancient Chinese spirits, which would help defeat the barbarians. So their success was almost guaranteed. And remember that the Chinese imperial court was also ridden with superstitious beliefs of that kind. It wasn't just the Boxers. So these things kind of melded together to gain imperial support for the Boxers. By 1899, because of the Boxers, much of North China was in anarchy, and marauding Boxers began killing Christians first, Chinese Christians first. They then spread out to start murdering Western missionaries. They murdered their first Western missionary on December 31st, 1899. In that case, the Chinese authorities executed the killers and cooperated in the investigation and whatever passed for a judicial process. But after that, they ceased cooperating with Westerners entirely. And then the mass butchery of Western missionaries and their families was well underway by the summer of 1900. The Boxers and their the governors who supported them had no compunction against killing all missionaries and their families. There was a particularly terrible incident in the summer of 1900 where in the courtyard of one of the imperial governors, they brought in men, women, and children and beheaded 45 of them in a mass execution in the governor's courtyard. And they did it in the most cruel way you could imagine. They executed the Protestant missionary men first while the women and children watched. Then they cut the heads off of the women while the children watched, and then the children. It was really awful. Then they brought in the Catholic bishop, priests, and nuns and beheaded all of them as well. In all, 45 people were killed. The Westerners remembered that and insisted that guy either commit suicide or be executed after the conflict. And yes, he did not live long afterwards.
The guy who was carrying out the executions.
The guy who was carrying out the executions. I mean, he even got tired of waiting, so he told the soldiers, grab your swords and cut some more heads off quicker, and they weren't very good at it, which meant it took several hacks, which increased the suffering. So it was really just a horrible, horrible, horrible event in the summer of 1900. Murders were common. Chinese Christians and missionaries and Westerners in general were trying to flee from the Boxers, who were drawing closer and closer to Peking. And in Peking, in the beginning of June 1900, they murdered a Japanese diplomat as he was on his way conducting business in town in Peking. By then, because of the outbreak of all this violence, a substantial number of foreign warships, including U.S. Navy, had assembled off the Peiho. The Peiho was the river leading inland to Peking from Tientsin, today called Tianjin, which was one of the treaty ports, Marshall, if I'm correct on that, right? And because it was a treaty port, it had a substantial foreign settlement outside the city walls. and it was in danger as well because of the Boxers. These ships, foreign warships, landed sailors and Marines in Tientsin. As the situation became more serious, a British admiral on the scene in Tientsin mounted what's called the Seymour Expedition, named after him, Admiral Sir Edward Seymour. They set out for Peking on June 10th. They had 2,129 men, British, French, German, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Japanese, and 111 Americans. And they got halfway to Peking in one day, but then they bogged down because they were relying on a single rail line to supply them. And the Boxers found it very easy to cut the rail line. So they were forced to retreat. At one point, they got surrounded. They finally fought their way back to Tientsin. Meanwhile, the Boxers began to attack the foreign settlement at Tientsin. And Chinese imperial troops began strengthening the Taku forts, which were the forts located at the mouth of the river. On June 17th, the Western countries and Japan had insisted that they vacate the forts. They refused. And on June 17th, the Allies stormed and captured both of the forts, as well as 4 Chinese destroyers which were operating nearby. So when the Allies attacked the Taku forts and took them, that brought imperial troops into the conflict. So now it wasn't just a conflict between the Boxers and the Westerners anymore, with the Chinese imperial government standing back and watching and rooting for the Boxers. It now became an open conflict between the imperial troops and the Boxers fighting against the various Western allies, which became known as the Eight Nations Alliance. I realize I've misspoken a couple of times here and said Western allies. We should remember that the Japanese were a key component of the alliance as well and played an important role in all of these actions that I'm describing. Finally, the Allies also stormed the walled city of Tientsin, and that gave them control of the mouth of the Peiho. Now, meanwhile, up in Peking, one of the most dramatic events probably in colonial military history took place, and that was the siege of the foreign legations in Peking. Foreigners and Chinese Christians were streaming into the legation quarter of Peking, seeking refuge from the Boxers. And troops and civilians from the legations had been making sorties out into town and the surrounding countryside to collect missionaries and other foreigners, Chinese converts, and so forth, and took to just shooting Boxers on sight. The Chinese government gave the foreigners and the legations an ultimatum: either stay and be massacred or leave Peking by June 20th. But the people in the legations assumed that if they did leave, they'd be massacred anyway. So they elected to stay. And maybe proving their point, on June 20th, which was the deadline for the ultimatum for them to leave town, the German minister in Peking, and minister, another term for ambassador used at the time, Baron von Kettler, he went to the Zhongli Yamen, which is sort of a foreign ministry of the Qing dynasty. He was on his way there to do some business when he was murdered. When news came back that he was murdered, suddenly the people in the legations realized that they really had no choice but to try to stay and fight it out. So they ignored the requirement to leave, and on June 20th, the siege began on that afternoon, with about 3,000 foreigners and Chinese converts besieged in the legation quarter. They were defended by 409 sailors and Marines of the Eight Nations Alliance, plus about 125 armed civilian volunteers. And there was another besieged area about 2 miles to the northwest in the Peitang, or North Cathedral, which is a French cathedral, where 3,400 people, fewer than 100 of them foreigners, were besieged, and they were defended by only 43 French sailors. The siege of these two places lasted 55 days. And if you see the 1963 movie 55 Days at Peking, it stars Charlton Heston, Ava Gardner, David Niven. It's a work of historical fiction. It's not terribly accurate in terms of depicting the siege, but it does give you the flavor of the time, and it can be a fun movie to watch in that regard.
Charlton Heston gets to rescue a shady Russian countess.
Yeah, and he's in love with Ava Gardner or whatever, and there's a romantic subplot. These kind of things go on in Hollywood movies, right?
Ava was very shady. You know.
But in the siege itself, people ate ponies and dogs. They were fortunate that there had been horse races nearby right before the siege, and so the ponies were still around. And so they brought the ponies in and ate them, and that gave people a lot of food to eat during the siege. They also wound up eating dogs, but they were actually pretty well fed during the siege. They had enough water too. The Boxers were militarily disorganized and incompetent. They didn't know how to aim rifles. They just knew to point them in the general direction and shoot them. They mostly were using swords and spears versus guns and artillery. That didn't work very well. And neither they nor the imperial troops took advantage of occasional opportunities that arose to actually break through the defenses. There were several times when they actually could have and probably gotten in and massacred everybody, but they did not. Why? And this is kind of an interesting point, and it's part of misunderstanding China. the people in the legations, especially the military people watching this, said, it doesn't make any sense. These people are idiots. Why aren't they attacking us? They should have overrun us on day one. Well, there are explanations. Partly because Chinese military leaders viewed weapons and equipment and ammunition they acquired as their personal property to be used with thrift and necessary for their own power against one another. They were disinclined to use a lot of that equipment or power to allocate it very effectively. We'll see this again in the 1940s, by the way.
Well, we're kind of seeing, that there's an imaginative take on China that I think we're seeing in the Boxer period that is going to continue all the way through, that there's more of a central control than there actually really is.
Yes.
It's like the Dowager Empress is sort of like letting things happen, but she's not really controlling things. And they're expecting that this is all part of some elaborate scheme, and because this is the way we would do it. We would, if we were going to do this, we would do it that way.
That comment is spot on, because you're right that the Boxers were this disorganized force that arose out of nowhere that the imperial government was just trying to take advantage of. The Boxers had no central control. In fact, they were just bands of different people with their own little separate leaders, separate rules, separate laws, separate costumes they wore. Just small groups that were all happened to have a common enemy. They didn't really have any common organization of any type. But even within the imperial forces, which were more organized, you had less of a united front than the Westerners assumed. The overall Chinese imperial commander of the forces besieging the legations was a fellow named Zhu Lung. And for one thing, he didn't want to give one of the other generals who was attacking part of the perimeter much of the artillery and ammunition that he controlled, because, again, that was his. He didn't want to empower the other guy at his own expense. This is common in Chinese military thinking. It wasn't just about fighting your enemy. It was about making sure you maintain your power against your fellow Chinese warlord or general.
Which we're going to see happen very much so during the Republic.
Yeah, we're going to see that again later. Anyway, another issue is that there's some evidence. It can't really be definitely proven, but there's some evidence from things that he said and wrote and were recorded that Zhu Lung felt that the whole thing might be a really bad idea, because if they went in and actually massacred the foreigners in the legations, that'd bring all hell down on China. And I think he was probably correct in that assessment.
Oh, yeah.
The outside world had very little idea of what was going on in Peking and feared the worst. There were false reports that the legation population has already been massacred. There were memorial services held for them, even though that had not happened. Seymour's failed expedition led to a belief that you needed an overwhelming number of troops to land in China and march in Peking. There were estimates that you need 50 or 60,000 or 70,000 to get there. And it was not clear that anyone was left to save even if he did get there. So kind of a lethargy set in, and not much was done to go actually relieve Peking. But finally, a fellow named Gasly, a British general, Alfred Gasly, arrived in China with orders to relieve Peking. And basically, he got off the ship, came in, and said, right then, let's get on with it, and put together a force of somewhere between 16 and 20,000 men. It's not clear how many, 2,000 of them Americans, and marched up the Peiho towards Peking. By the way, the Japanese, and I think we mentioned earlier that the Japanese got a lot of credit for what they did during the Boxer Rebellion. They very much impressed the Westerners. They actually did a lot of the fighting along the way, and very successfully along the march up the Peiho. But they routed Chinese imperial troops and the Boxers in a number of engagements. The Chinese force began melting away. They broke into Peking. They relieved the legations on August 14th after 55 days. And during the 55 days, 66 foreigners in the legations had been killed, and 2 adults and 6 children had died of other causes. But it could have been much, much worse.
When you looked at the Boxer Rebellion, Mike, did you find any noteworthy people present there during this?
Oh yeah, I mean, for
people
those
who would later go on to have, shall we say, somewhat interesting careers.
Yes, I can name 2 or 3 off the top of my head. So John Jellicoe,
yes,
who became the admiral who commanded the Grand Fleet in the first half of World War I in the Royal Navy, he was there. I think he was Seymour's chief of staff, if I remember correctly. There's another British officer who is probably going to be far more obscure to most listeners, but there was a fellow named Christopher Craddock who was a commander, and he wound up fighting against Graf Spee's squadron in the Pacific in 1914 and went down with his ship there. So people who know about the Battle of Coronel will be familiar with Christopher Craddock. Herbert Hoover
Yes.
was a young engineer who did some useful work in supporting the forces as they marched up to Peiho, is my understanding. Do you know more about that?
Yes. There was actually a persistent rumor because there is one person who was there that you have not mentioned, and this was Smedley Butler.
He was a United States Marine Corps first lieutenant who served in the capture of Tientsin, and he was wounded and promoted to captain for his valor during the Gazali expedition. He went on to retire from the Marine Corps in 1931 with the rank of Major General, which is a 2-star general. And in the 1930s, curiously enough, he became a vocal anti-war activist. At the time of his death in 1940, he was the most decorated member of the U.S. Marine Corps in history.
So the story goes. I don't know whether this is true. The only two people that could confirm it would be disinclined to do so, and that would be Hoover and Smedley Butler. But supposedly Smedley Butler found Hoover hiding amongst the women, and that this was some sort of continuing source of a rift between the two of them. That Hoover felt like, yes, Hoover did like a lot of his usual relief type work, but the fact that Smedley Butler found him amongst the women, that did not necessarily look good. And so the rumor goes, Smedley Butler had this to hold over Hoover, and Hoover knew it, and Hoover hated Butler, and later made him pay for this when he was president.
So the Boxer Rebellion had many other repercussions,
Yes.
like what I'm going to get into right here.
Yes.
But with the legations relieved, Peking in the control of the Eight Nations Alliance, the Imperial Army was in chaos, the Boxers were collapsing. So the Imperial Court fled Beijing on August 15th. They headed south and west on a 700-mile journey that took them 2 months before they settled in at the imperial governor's quarters at Xi'an, now spelled Xi'an.
Yes.
Which is actually where that terrible slaughter of mass execution had happened a few months before. Chinese and foreigners looted and vandalized Peking. It actually took until September 1901, so over a year later, before they worked out a peace agreement between the Eight Nations Alliance and the Chinese government, which required a bunch of things. China had to pay a huge indemnity, 65.5 million pounds sterling, and I looked it up, and that would be about $11.6 billion in 2025 dollars, to be paid out over the course of 39 years. It would take till 1940 to pay it off. Only the United States, among the aggrieved powers, asked for it to be reduced. The United States asked for it to be reduced by a third, but nobody listened, and it was not reduced. There were a lot of executions and mandatory suicides. You could be ordered to commit suicide of the imperial governors and other officials who were responsible for supporting the Boxers, and this was done at the insistence of the foreigners. Greater basing of foreign troops in China was permitted, and adjustments were made to foreign spheres of influence. Sharp-eared listeners will remember that I said that Italy had a sphere of influence by about 1900, but I also mentioned that it had been rebuffed when it tried to get one in 1899. Well, because of the Boxer Rebellion, it got one. So that's just one example of a change. Eventually, when the peace agreement was signed, the Imperial Court decided to return to Peking, where it arrived in January 1902. So where did this leave everything? According to my research, foreigners really learned nothing from the Boxer Rebellion about China. Nothing at all. It just confirmed previous views they had, which weren't terribly well informed.
And we're kind of prejudiced.
Oh, very prejudiced, because what foreigners had come to do, and this includes really the missionaries and business people and whatever military people were there, they viewed the Chinese as both foolish and evil people.
Yeah.
They thought they were prone to behaving like imbeciles even when dealing with their own interests. If anything, their behavior around the perimeter of the legations tended to confirm, at least for the military people, that they were idiots when it came to fighting, for example, right? And everything about the rebellion seemed to confirm these views. And the people, the Westerners at the time, showed very little curiosity as to why the attacks happened. It's kind of interesting. They just sort of viewed it as an act of God, like a natural disaster. So the Chinese are like this, and once in a while they just start attacking you. And this is one of the worst ones, one of the worst attacks that happened. That's just kind of how they are. And there really wasn't much thought given to it beyond that. So Westerners learned next to nothing.
And I would argue that this was the prevailing view of Westerners before as well. If anything, this is just elevates that
Absolutely.
theory to a higher level.
Yeah.
And people would be disinclined to look at the Chinese in any way other than that, kind of like petulant children, petulant, ignorant children, slow, petulant children, even, until you actually get to a sort of revisionism, which starts with Joseph Needham and his whole research into Chinese science that starts in the 40s. But that's a story for another day.
It's also not entirely clear why it happened from the Chinese perspective either.
Yeah.
In fairness to people that are trying to figure out why it happened, it's not really clear. The Boxer movement kind of popped into existence. Nobody was really expecting it. It just sort of grew out of almost nothing as far as both the Chinese court and Westerners could see.
This is the Chinese street.
The Chinese street, erupted. Yeah, I mean, you talked about the Arab street back in the in 2011, that. Yeah, it kind of was like that. That's a good way of thinking about it, I guess.
There are parallels. There are parallels of what we see in China that we see happening later on in the Middle East.
Yeah. The imperial court wanted to kill all the foreigners in China. They thought the Chinese spirits that the Boxers could summon would help achieve that purpose. They were very superstitious. The Empress Dowager had a tendency to believe the men around her when they assured her of success, and so she tended to agree with the things that they proposed. And so Westerners learned nothing from the Boxer Rebellion, and it also achieved nothing for the Chinese. The Qing dynasty lasted until 1911 or 1912, as we discussed, but the Chinese century of humiliation went on well into the 20th century.
Yes.
You can see why missionaries, though, after the experiences of all the atrocities committed against them in 1899, 1900, why they would, particularly 1900, they would be prone to want to live in fortified compounds and look to their personal security much more than maybe they would have before the events of the Boxer Rebellion.
And I mean, this has an impact. This has an impact on the culture because the missionaries are leading ever more isolated lives after this. And they're kind of living in cantonments, generally at missionary colleges or at hospitals or significant settlements. It's not always people. There were people who operated small enterprises to kind of reach out for outreach. But by and large, the well-educated missionary would kind of try to be associated with an institution.
So can I ask you real quick then? So even before the Boxer Rebellion, there was the tendency for Westerners to live in foreign quarters.
Yes. Particularly among the merchants.
But I mean, the missionaries tended to be more out in the countryside, and in that sense, more vulnerable. So what you're saying is what changed is that the missionaries now also were living in
kind of splendid isolation and
more fortified places, more removed from.
And I mean, you might get if we try to look at our cast of characters and kind of try to infer a certain dynamic, you would have people that might see the missionaries as the way ahead. Someone like Charlie Sung, who we met in the last episode, who's kind of seeing, let's get on board with the foreigners because they can actually teach us stuff. They can provide us with income, that kind of dynamic. But it's not that they're actually, even though you've got people who are missionaries, they're not part of the environment at all. They're basically, they have Western clothing that they're wearing. There's no attempt to blend in. The kind of furnishings and other goods that they're getting, it's from Sears Roebuck. They'll go through the catalog and order things that way, or they'll get them from missionary barrels that'll come from Westerners. They're not necessarily attempting to even use Chinese-made tables, chairs, things like that could be purchased in China, and in an earlier time were quite prized, at least amongst Chinese merchants back in the 19th century. Food is American as it could be, and children, once they reached a certain age, they were sent back to the U.S. to attend boarding school, not unlike missionaries, say, in Hawaii. And they would be looking to go into Eastern universities, elite Eastern universities. Outside the settlements, the missionaries and their families would kind of gaze out into the vastly more impoverished Chinese peasants. There is a passage in a book that I consulted about Henry Luce, who we'll deal with subsequently in this program, where they're staring out and looking at their very nicely well-landscaped cantonment with trees and things like that, and they'll be wondering why the Chinese don't have any trees. Well, they're cutting them down to use them for fuel. And this just doesn't appear to register. Like, why are they living lives of such impoverishment? Well, life is nasty, brutish, and short, and you have to make use of whatever resources you have. And because you're living this isolated life, you have no appreciation for what life is really like. The ways of the Chinese peasant are both curious and suspect. And despite their intent to want to live in China, they might as well be living in Akron, Ohio, for all the good it's going to do them, for all the understanding that they're going to have of the place. The daily struggle of Chinese peasants at this point is not really something that fits into their calculations.
So if you're a missionary in China, what you're trying to do is take the Chinese people and convert them into Americans.
Yeah.
And other than that, you have no interest in them.
That's right, because basically they have screwed up their life.
Right.
And I mean, think about this, what we've encountered so far in China. We've encountered opium wars. We've encountered this huge civil war. They're not finding a lot of things other than tea and silk and things of that nature, things that you can actually take back to the West that there's a market for as being worthwhile in China. There's nothing in terms of the oldest civilization on the planet that they're finding of value at this point. And a lot of them, even though initially there was a prohibition on learning Chinese that the Chinese themselves imposed, they're not necessarily all that familiar with China. They're not able to deal with China. So, like in the case of Henry Luce, who we're about to meet, Henry Luce's father understood Chinese. His mother never did. And she lived there for 30, 40 years. And it never really affected her, even though she's living in the country, because this is how insulated society is.
In your research, remember in the America First series at one point, we talked about the idea that if you were some kind of a failure in life, if you were poor,
yes,
it happened because you deserved it.
Yes,
it was a moral failing on your part to be unsuccessful, right? That
yes.
idea that pervaded
that Protestant
thinking,
idea.
That Protestant idea. I imagine that was then transposed to China as well, that you're looking at these peasants and saying that they
lead vicious lives.
They're like that because of the terrible life that they live.
Because of their viciousness.
Right. Yeah, which fits like I said, they learned nothing from the Boxer Rebellion. It just confirmed all their worst bigoted ideas about them.
They're assuming a certain agency
Yeah.
that just isn't there.
Yeah.
And they don't really understand how the society works here.
Let me just interject very briefly. This doesn't really comport with anything that I had thought about China. This is actually quite astounding to me, and I'm coming fairly cold at this, but I had no idea. I mean, this is such an ancient civilization, and one would think that it was more advanced than this.
Oh, it was. It was. I mean, this was what we benefited from when we were in school. There had been a total revision, because people had actually had a chance to look at some of the stuff that were in archives, and they had a sense of, paper and gunpowder and all of those things that you get in basically middle school history of civilization or history of world history. That stuff had kind of come through, and that China was an advanced civilization was something that we understood at that point. Particularly like when we're in school, like in the 70s and stuff like that, and China's like this whole new thing. Yes, but it's like there is a totally different view about things in the early part of the 20th century that is radically different for people's expectations here and understanding.
So clarify that then. What contrast the two for us more clearly then?
What you have in what it's revealed is that you have a society that was very much far more advanced than Europe was for most of the history of humanity, that led a much higher existence and was much more technologically advanced, even with peasants, even with what peasants knew about farming and agriculture and various techniques. There were things that China knew that the West didn't. That's kind of that took a while for people to find out about. And that was something that I would say we kind of got a better handle on what China was capable of in the 70s in the West. That's my experience. Before that, and this is kind of jumping ahead, and we'll get into this in the next episode, China was kind of off limits. People did, people did not have that same appreciation, at least, particularly in this country. The British were a little bit different with regard to that.
But I want to ask you, though, again, to clarify. So when did we, the West, become aware of Chinese achievements in the past when they were so technologically advanced? That was well before what you're talking about. We quoted Ben Franklin at the beginning of this time about what a great society they were and everything. And that was
moral society, but a technical
century.
Society.
But not the technical.
The technical aspects. This is the result of a gentleman by the name of Joseph Needham.
And when?
And Joseph Needham went over to China in the 40s as part of
in the 1940s.
In the 1940s during the war.
But what about things like the Chinese invention of gunpowder, for example, was well understood? Wasn't it before that? And that was a technological advance. I'm trying to straighten out what we did and didn't know.
Well, with Chinese gunpowder, the way that the Westerners were approaching it in the historiography, we, the West, we built cannons and heavy artillery when we got gunpowder.
They just made fireworks.
Made fireworks. Trivial-minded people who are not necessarily, who may...
Sure, they invented it, but they didn't really take advantage of it.
That's right.
We're the ones who took advantage of it, not them.
Yes.
And that's because we're, smarter, more advanced.
And then printing, which is existing over there, doesn't have nearly the revolutionary impact as it does
in
Europe. When the printing press comes along and it kind of fosters the Reformation and things like that. There are with China, there's more of an attempt to keep society stable, and this is not something that is appreciated well in the West because it's kind of counter to the way that the West operates, where there is constant change going on. Through technology, China is attempting to incorporate the technology to keep society on an even keel.
Well, and there's also the issue, and we talked about it earlier in this series, that China was a universal empire.
Yeah.
And what's been found over and over again in human history is that the Roman Empire is kind of an outlier on this, but many universal empires become insular, complacent, and they stagnate. We talked about this previously. And that certainly seems to be the case in China. They were making all these advances. We talked about some technology, astronomy, they were quite advanced in, things like that, right? They were making all these advances but at some point, they kind of stopped and started falling behind.
Yeah.
And what you're alluding to is Europeans, and some people have said that's because Europeans all kept fighting each other all the time. They had to innovate to survive. Since they were not universal empires, they were constantly struggling with each other, and then they went out to conquer the rest of the world as well, they kind of erupted onto the scene. And universal empires like China were at a big disadvantage because they had not kept developing and advancing. With an inward focus, where you're just trying to keep your society stable, maybe you don't need a lot of those kind of innovations. When the other side shows up suddenly and they've made those innovations and you're way behind them, you're going to get hurt for it. And that's what happened with China. And it happened to others as well.
Yes, it happened to other places as well. And, some people who are into eugenics, which seems to be a constant with this podcast, us talking about eugenicists, there is a notion that, hey, this is what, this constant change is what you need to order in order to be a proper civilization here. Au contraire, that is not the case. That is kind of an accident of history. Do not mistake an accident of history that kind of results in a certain pathway to being something that's genetic.
Yeah, the problem with eugenics is that they keep ascribing historical and cultural outcomes to innate genetic traits.
Yes,
and that's nonsense.
It is. Like there's like some sort of spirit or something. I mean, when they assert this, if you try to pick it apart, you can actually get to how nonsensical this is. Yeah. But it's like until you actually pick it apart, of course, Germans are better than anybody else, or whoever's better than anybody else. You get that kind of argument. So Henry Luce was a product of this whole missionary culture here. He grew up in China. His parents were missionaries. As I said, his father was more adept at the Chinese language than he was. Henry Luce, after growing up and living in going to a boarding school in China, he went to Hotchkiss, which was a preparatory school for Eastern elite colleges, and then to Yale. And in 1923, he would go on to found what became Time Life Incorporated, relying on generous donations from fellow alumni at Yale to provide financing. One might think that, missionaries were good about raising money. Henry learned how to make money from his background there. He's very much a man in sync with his era. 1920s America is when there was general interest. News magazines were coming up and were most popular. This is before radio, but the idea was that these magazines would provide a more in-depth coverage of international and local events.
So news magazines were an innovation of the 1920s.
Yes.
I did not realize that. Okay.
I mean, you would have general interest magazines, but having things like Life. Life didn't happen until the 30s, but things like Look and Newsweek and things like that. These are things that actually come about during that period. You would have the kind of magazines you would have would be something like The Atlantic, where you wouldn't try to summarize the whole week's activity.
Right.
You would have columnists come in and write what they wanted to write.
Yeah, you had women's magazines. There were engineering magazines, naval magazines,
And his
like
idea was to basically say, okay, so, you also had the Reader's Digest as well, but it was all about trying to condense things down. In a sense, these are kind of like the internet of their day, of being able to sort of like go through and summarize the news for people that otherwise might not be able to do so. Now, they are relying exclusively on wire services initially, and the way that they do it, it's all about packaging. They have like a weird sort of what was called time speak, which would rely on things like the German syntax, for example, to try and pep up how the news was being presented. So Luce is an innovator of the media of the time, and eventually he would deploy a number of correspondents around the world to include China, whose messages would be crafted not to reflect their perceptions, but Luce's own. Overseas presence would certainly increase by the mid-1930s with the initiation of Luce's second leading publication, Life magazine. Life pioneered in the field of photojournalism. You cannot do that. You cannot do photojournalism just relying on wire service reporting. You kind of have to have people be there. And Life became, even more so than Time, became like the vehicle of kind of demonstrating what was going on in China. There's a famous picture that was taken of a baby crying in the middle of some rubble that appeared in Life. This would not have been something you would have found in the days before there was such a thing as photojournalism. And this was a powerful message. It kind of illustrated and developed support for the Chinese in their fight with the Japanese here.
There'd been a Japanese air raid, and the photographer got a picture of, like you said, this little toddler baby, sitting upright in the middle of the rubble in the street or something, crying. And injured, too, I think.
Yes.
Suffering from some burns.
Yes.
I'm told that child eventually grew up and lived a decent life, but it was a very dramatic photo.
And this sort of message is consistent with what the regime wants to be presented.
Yes.
And in this case, Luce was very working kind of hand in glove with them and in support of the nationalist government. At this point, we're going to leave Henry Luce, and we are going to end this episode. In the forthcoming episode, we're going to actually look at how the government is functioning in China and what people like Luce are doing in order to further its ends.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Henke. Till next time.